Hello. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, has the responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Good afternoon and good evening to our guests. I'm Sean Garrick, Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the University of Illinois. Thank you for joining us today for In Dialogue, Yossi, Klein, Halevi, and Mohammad Darawshe on Israel and Palestine. Today, we will have a 90-minute conversation with author and journalist Yossi, Klein, Halevi, and Mohammad Darawshe, a leading political analyst who has spent more than 3 decades advocating for Israel's Arab sector in various governmental and NGO roles. At the conclusion of the conversation, we will ask the panelists questions that were submitted by participants during registration. I'll read a brief bio, but full biographies for each of the panelists are available at the OBCDI website. Yossi Klein Halevi, New York Times bestselling author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antalepi of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity in Israel. Mohammad Darawshe, a leading political analyst who has spent more than 3 decades advocating for Israel's Arab sector. He is the Director of Planning, Equality, and Shared Society at Givat Haviva, Israel's oldest organization promoting cohesion and understanding between its Jewish and Arab citizens. He has also served as strategic advisor on initiatives for the Arab sector in the Prime Minister's office. Again, full biographies are available at the OBCDI website. We're also very fortunate to have Chancellor Robert Jones here with us as the moderator for today's dialogue. Chancellor Jones is the 10th Chancellor of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and we want to thank you for making time in your schedule to be with us today. And with that, Chancellor Jones, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And let me also start by saying to each and every one of you, good afternoon. And thank you for watching and participating in today's conversation. This dialogue is over a year in the making. We were planning to execute this about a year ago, but delayed by pandemic. The original schedule for last spring was put off until now. And so to our honored guests, I can't tell you how excited we are to have you and to welcome you to the University of Illinois, although it's virtual. I am very, very glad that we'll have this chance to have this conversation because it addresses issues that are certainly important to Israel, important to our university community, and I think important to the world community as well. So without further ado, because we have a number of different questions and opportunities to engage with our guests in dialogue, so we'll begin. So let's get started. And to get started, I'm going to ask each of you to just tell us a little bit about yourselves, a bit about your background, where you live in Israel, and critically importantly, how you have come to know each other. And so I'll start with Yossi. If you could start, and then Mohammad, you will follow, and then we'll rotate and alternate as we go through the questions. But again, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Jones, and thank you for the hospitality. Mohammad, it's always a pleasure to be with you in whatever configuration. I'll say a few words really about my background. I live in Jerusalem. I have 3 kids, one of whom is completing a degree in jazz at the new school. Another child teaches art to children. And a third is involved with creating soccer teams in Jewish and Arab communities around the country. And, so these are that's my lineup. As you can hear from my accent, I was born and raised in New York. My father was a Holocaust survivor, and that was really a formative event in my life. I've lived in Israel for coming on to 40 years. Actually, this next year will be my 40th anniversary. And I do work in Muslim-Jewish relations at Hartman Institute. And the relationship between Israel's Jewish citizens and Palestinian citizens is, to me, one of to my mind, one of the most crucial determinants for Israel's future. And it's really in that context that I met Mohammad. We've been friends, colleagues now for many years. As a fellow at the Hartman Institute as well. And most important, we agree about many things and we disagree about many things, but we disagree within a context of a shared project of how do we make Israeli citizenship truly meaningful for Israel's Arab citizens? How do we extend Israel's democratic promise to the 20+% of its citizens?
Thank you very much. Mohammad?
Thank you, Chancellor Jones, and great honor to be with you, and especially with Yossi as well. I'm from a village called Excel, and that's where I'm talking to you from. It's a village just to the south of Nazareth, the city of Nazareth, in the Jezreel Valley area. And my family has lived here. I'm 27th generation, and my kids are 28th generation in the same town. My family constitutes about 50% of the population of the town, which is about 15,000 residents. So we are about half of that. I did not immigrate to Israel. Israel immigrated to me. We're the indigenous Palestinian population that has lived here in the same town for close to 800 years, but in the whole land of Palestine, land of Israel, for approximately 1,400 years. I do have 4 kids. My wife is from Jerusalem. My 4 kids are all students at university. My older son is doing his master's in business administration, and my 3 daughters, one is doing her PhD in genetics at the Technion, then another going to dentistry school in her first year of dentistry school, and the youngest is a freshman at Haifa University. She wants to study law. So the 4 of them are at school at the same time, and my wife works in our local municipality. She's in charge of training women for employment, running employment training programs. And the issue of Jewish-Arab relations for me is more important than it is probably for Yossi, because for me it's a matter of existential nature. For minority, dependency on the majority is more important than the majority's relationship to the minority. From my point of view, almost every part of my life has something to do with the majority population, with the Jewish majority population, starting from the electricity we have at home, all the way to universities which we go to, the job places, the government, transportation, you name it. The minority is very, very dependent on the majority in its existence. And but I live in a 100% Arab Muslim town, and the first Jews I met were people I met when I was in an engineered program meeting between high school kids when I was 17, and that was a moment of enlightenment of first of all, I would say the humanization process, where I started looking at Jews beyond just being a political case, with whom I have a disagreement, or a security case where they're always the representative of either the police or the military. It was also a chance to start having a narrative debate and discuss differences and not just eat hummus together. But with time, beginning to realize that we have a lot of interests that we need to focus on together. And through this, I've been doing also some kind of research work at the Hartman Institute, and that's where Yossi and our roads crossed. And it seems since then, our roads have been started getting more and more connected. It's not just a cross, but now we're traveling in a parallel path with a lot of crosses on the way. Going into a discussion, I would say, on the three levels I mentioned, whether it is the issue of the personal, the interpersonal discussion of getting to know the person as a human being, as a parent, as a scholar, with whom you can enjoy a moment or get upset in that moment. But then also having the intellectual debate, where we also learn how to agree or disagree on issues, but also have the courage to look and develop the mutual interests for our two communities, realizing that he's here to stay and I'm here to stay. Maybe not as individuals, but our families and children and grandchildren in the future need to develop a place where we need to make it work. Right now, it's pretty much dysfunctional. It's not functioning on the way that is worth leaving it as an inheritance for our children. And that's why I feel a duty to improve it in my lifetime.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammad. And you both have touched on the following question, but it's very, very apparent to me that you have, in many ways, very different lived experiences, but at the same time, there is apparently some very critically important common ground that you share. So, Yossi, could you share with us your own lived experiences and how those lived experiences has shaped your views on the issues affecting Israeli Palestinian relations? And in this dialogue that we're having today, I think it's important to elaborate a bit on how the two of you have come to this dialogue and what brings you to it, what compelled you to take this path. That is probably a road less traveled among some of your constituents. And the other question is, how do you kind of sustain this? How do you sustain it, create more momentum? How do you create two other partners like yourself to have such dialogue as the way of moving towards some collective goals?
So in terms of my own personal experience, I went on a journey in the late 1990s into Palestinian society. It was a year-long journey. I went as ostensibly, formally, as a journalist, as a writer, and I did produce a book about it. But my deeper purpose was really going as a pilgrim. I was going as a pilgrim both to my neighbors' faiths. I went to mosques, monasteries. I was invited to pray, to participate in Muslim prayer line. I had the privilege of experiencing something of the power of Muslim prayer, extraordinary power, surrendered to God. And as a religious Jew, this was for me an expansive experience. But I also went as a pilgrim to the Palestinian people. I went to try to understand something of my neighbors, something of their lives, how they experience this conflict. And I was looking for that shared intimacy as much as possible. I was looking for a way of understanding as much as possible. And that experience, which was very powerful, was followed by the second, what we call here the second Intifada, the 4 years of suicide bombings, followed by the Israeli army reoccupying villages and towns in the West Bank. And this was really, I would say, one of the most traumatic experiences. I was raising at the time 2 teenage kids in Jerusalem. And you never know if we'd see them again at night. They would go off to school. You always made sure to hug them before they left because that was just the way. And the second Intifada, the experience of that pattern, metaphorically and literally, transformed Israeli society. It turned Israeli society decidedly rightward. Many Israelis who until then had been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause turned away. And for many years, I turned away as well. I felt deeply disillusioned. I felt that Israel, again, this is the Israeli narrative, now there's counter narrative. But the Israeli narrative, which I very deeply believe in, is that an Israeli government really did try to make peace. We made a sincere offer, and we were met with violent rejection. Most Israeli Jews really believe that narrative, and that has shaped how this society looks at the conflict. Now, what changed for me was getting involved with a program at the Hartman Institute called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which Sean made brief reference to, and which Mohammad has been very, very much involved in as well. That is bringing Muslim American leaders to Israel, to the Hartman Institute, to study Judaism, to study Israel, the conflict, from both sides. And that experience really helped me to see what this conflict looks like through the other side's eyes. And it's almost as if I was borrowing the eyes of the other. And when you step out of yourself, and this is not to say that I still don't deeply believe my narrative, I do. But when you see the conflict through other eyes, when you experience that radical, disjointed perspective of suddenly looking at yourself objectively, looking at yourself, your people, your country, the way others see you, the way our Palestinian neighbors see us and experience our presence here. Something broke in me in a very positive way. And I live literally on the border of the West Bank. I live in the last row of houses in Jerusalem. I look out onto the West Bank. And right outside my window is the security wall, the wall that divides the state of Israel from the West Bank. And the experience of borrowing the eyes of others and looking at myself objectively forced me to see my neighbors in a way that I had not wanted to since the 70s, but I wasn't able to. I was so caught in my pain, my trauma, my anger, that I wasn't able to see from the other side. And the gift that I received from this program, the Harvard Institute, and the gift that I've received from you, Mohammad, I have to say, the times we've spent together in this program and in other contexts has really expanded my capacity to understand, hopefully, understand this conflict in ways that I didn't before. Again, without sacrificing my love for my story, my people's story, my love for Israel. But that love is not, it's not a zero-sum game. And to be able to accommodate your neighbor's pain, your neighbor's trauma, your neighbor's counter-narrative is, I think, essential for moving forward. And as Mohammad said, for leaving our children and grandchildren with a better story than we received.
Thank you so much. Mohammad?
Well, I left you at the opening remarks. I left you when I was 17, when I had my first encounter with the Jewish youth my age. And as I said earlier, this was intriguing, mind-boggling. For the first time, I'm meeting a Jewish human being and not just a soldier or a government official or a police officer, not a function from the Jewish power structure, but a kid who's my age, with whom we could, first of all, argue and debate narratives, and where I could tell my truth and slowly start to listen and hear their truth, and learn also how to win a debate with them, to prove that when you talk about narrative, you don't really have to accept the other narrative. You don't have to lose your own narrative, but you start understanding that there is a separate narrative, that others do believe in it and consider it as their truth. But parallel to that debate, which I think, I started it 40 years ago, and I think I probably will never finish it in my lifetime. But it's a debate where every time you go into it, you learn two things. One, you learn more things about yourself. And second, you learn more things about your debate partner or your counterpart. But it was so intriguing for me that when I went to university 2 years later, the first thing at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I'm a Muslim kid that went to Muslim elementary school, then I went to Catholic high school, and then I went to Hebrew University. And it went through the different faiths and different identity circles, which each time it challenged me. Going to Muslim elementary school, it's all there for you. You are one of the same type of group. It does help formulate yourself, your identity, your reference point, your anchors. But when going to a Catholic high school, you start creating the dialogue between yourself and your classmates who are from a different faith. And then going to Hebrew University and suddenly having Jewish classmates and Jewish teachers and professors, I wanted to learn more. And my idea was, okay, let me try to put together an encounter with Jewish students similar to what I did in high school. So I put together a dialogue group, which lasted for less than half an hour. It was about 15 Jewish and 15 Palestinian Arab students. Within less than half an hour, we started screaming and shouting at each other. You did this, no, you did that. And so we broke up, and then I thought I brought the wrong Jews. So I went and brought a different 15 Jews, which I thought they'll be lighter and nicer. And this lasted for 2 hours, but we refused to meet second time. And then I thought maybe it was the wrong Arabs that I brought. So I started making changes in the Arab group. And again, we fell after another 2 hours. Then I went back to the place that basically ran the first or engineered my first encounter. And I said, well, how do you do it? And they said, aha, well, this is a science. facilitation of conflict groups. You need to facilitate it in some kind of a scientific way where you unwrap the conflict. You do backdating. You go. There's a process that you need to go through, because sometimes a narrative debate can do more damage than good. It's like peeling an onion. It starts smelling more stronger with time, and you start crying. And that's the problem with the dialogue narrative identity debate. It could do the damage if you don't know how to fix it. So I started learning how do you actually facilitate cross conflict or cross cultural debate where you have narrative issues, and it's not just about culture sharing. You're probably more accustomed in the United States to dialogue between cultures, where it's more about culture sharing. In our case, it's not just about culture sharing. It's about hierarchic structures that exist, whether they're the political hierarchic structure or the financial and economic hierarchical structure or the governmental hierarchic structures, where there's a winning group and the losing group, or in any structure. So you can't just talk about the niceties in culture sharing. It's not just about how do we listen to each other's music and how do we accept the different color of the skin, or some of the habits in our holidays, or some of the food that we have. It's about powers, rejuggling the power structure. And that's where you go into the confrontational mood. Because from my point of view, when I engage in dialogue, it's not just about, okay, nice meeting you, Yossi, goodbye, see you next time. It's not about that. I want to change the power structure. I want to strip him some of his power and to increase my status, to bring my status higher, so that I aspire for equality. So it's a dialogue between unequals in the current political system, which is also resulting with economic and social disparities. So from my point of view, I have different interests in dialogue than what Yossi might want. He might want it to be maybe an intellectual or spiritual or an enlightening type of discourse. I want it to change reality. I want to make sure that my children do not continue to be discriminated. And they are being discriminated as we talk. I want to make sure that my nephews stop being discriminated. And they are being discriminated as we talk right now. There's no equal place for me socially, economically, and politically. So we have different vested interests in the dialogue, which does bring in some kind of tension in the dialogue. In Israel, if you ask most Israelis, Jews and Arabs, you ask them the question, do you support two things, equality and good relations between the two sides? You get a very solid majority of people saying yes. I think ultimately people are good in both sides. But there's some kind of conditional relationship between these two values, the equality and the good relations, or what sometimes we call good relations, we call it coexistence. There's a conditional relationship and its opposite conditional relationships. Most Jews would say, yes, but first of all, let's have good relations. And if it works, we will reward you with equality. Most Arab citizens say the exact opposites. Let's have equality first. And if you prove your good intentions of treating us as equals, we will reward you with good relations. It's like looking at holding the stick from the two different ends of it. Is it good relations that leads to equality, or is it equality that leads to good relations? In my view, and then from my life experience, these are two parallel tracks that you need to walk them one at a time, one step at a time. One cannot develop without the other. And this is my life wisdom, I would say, where you need to engage into this kind of co-learning of how do you create a common citizenship. You need to, Yossi called it, how should the Arab citizens learn to become Israelis? I would like also the Israeli Jews to learn how to become Israelis. because for them, being Israelis is being Jewish, because they pretty much confiscated the Israeli public sphere to the Jewish size only. And I want the Israeli public sphere to be suitable to all the different components of Israeli society, to include me, whether we talk about services or we talk about symbols. When we talk about the national anthem, I have nothing against the national anthem, and I respect it because it's important to Yossi. But today, a few hours ago, the Arab members of the parliament of the Knesset walked out of the inauguration ceremony of the new Knesset, of the new house, at the moment of playing the national anthem. Why? Because they feel that the national anthem is only a Jewish symbol and it's not an Israeli symbol. It's not inclusive, it's exclusive. They do not see themselves in that symbol. So that the Israeli size is I would say narrow to fit the Jewish citizen, not wide enough to fit the Israeli citizen. And that's the growth that the Israeli Jewish population needs to go through, parallel to the growth that the Arab citizens have to go through.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammad. It's very, very clear, I think, in both of your comments, is that although you come from different lived experiences, it's very, very clear to me that a commonality is around understanding the other, having a conversation as a way of leading to dialogue, hopefully to bring about change. So, Yossi, how did you come with the idea to write your neighbor in your book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor? And did you really hope to receive a response? And then for Mohammad, what motivated you to respond and to answer back to begin the process and the dialogue that you're currently having? And I could only imagine that it took a considerable amount of courage, perhaps on your part, to be able to agree to engage in this process.
Chancellor Jones, if with your permission, if I could just respond to one or two points that Mohammad raised, because I think it's really, really important in terms of where we share a common agenda and where we disagree.
Absolutely.
My shared vision with you, Mohammad, is a shared citizenship, is certainly full equality. It is an expansion of Israeli identity, so that when we say the word Israeli, we don't instinctively mean Jew. Israeli does not equal Jew. 20+% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish. And that's important for me as a Jew, as an Israeli. It's important for the integrity of my country. It's important for the promise that's enshrined in the Israeli Declaration of Independence of offering full equality to all of our citizens. That's a promise that has not yet been fulfilled. And where we perhaps disagree is why it hasn't been fulfilled. And I don't believe in excuses, but I believe in trying to understand the context of the situation. That is the war that was fought against the existence of a Jewish majority state for many years. And that has left lasting wounds on the Israeli Jewish side. Wounds that I believe we need to heal. We need to grow as a society. We need to own our majority status. The problem is, and you know this, is that you know this from your intimate relations with Israel, is that we Israeli Jews think of ourselves simultaneously as a majority and a minority. We're the majority in our little state, but we are very much a minority in the region. Israel is the only non-Arab and non-Arab state for thousands of kilometers around. And that has created a great deal of the sense of vulnerability. Not victimhood, we are by no means victims, we are the victors of this conflict. But there is a deep sense of vulnerability. And the majority-minority relationship between Jews and Arabs is very complicated. I don't know of any other relationship quite like it, where you have a minority that is living in a country whose majority is at war with its own people. And that has created a very complicated dynamic. And again, that's not an excuse. I think that the Israeli Jewish majority needs to grow up, needs to own and this is something that I've learned from you, Mohammad. This is something that the phrase that you've taught me, which is the Jews have to start acting like a majority. Maybe we've been a minority for so long that we don't quite know yet how to be a self-confident majority. We very often act from that place of defensiveness. So that was very important for me personally to clarify, because my own personal agenda as an Israeli is very much in harmony with Muhammad's vision. But again, we certainly disagree about the context and understanding how we do things.
Well, thank you for responding. We really appreciate it. But if you, I know our participants really would like to have a deeper understanding, as I said earlier, about your idea to write to your neighbor as a way of initiating dialogue and conversation, and as a way of trying to understand the other. And could you just comment on that as briefly as you can, and then we'll ask Mohammad to respond.
The truth is that this book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was really born out of insomnia. I'd be up late at night, sitting here at my desk, looking at the lights of two Palestinian villages on the next hill, and hearing the muezzin, the call to prayer at 4 in the morning, feeling this sense on the one hand of intimacy with my neighbors. There were times where I felt we could almost hear each other breathe, and yet profound estrangement and hostility. And so I wrote this book really without any preconceived notion of what kind of response I would get. The book was translated into Arabic and put online for free download. And to my surprise, I received hundreds of letters in response. Some of them hostile, some of them respectful, some of them engaged. Muhammad wrote a response, and that's going to appear in the Hebrew edition of the book, which is coming out very soon. And it was very important for me to do two things. One was to try to model what a respectful disagreement over our stories told from personal perspective. My book is written from a very personal perspective, and I invite personal responses from Palestinians. It was very important for me to model that kind of respectful disagreement. And the second thing that was really important for me was to end the book with the Palestinian responses, so that the new edition of the book, the paperback edition, has a 50-page epilogue, letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor. Some of those letters are very difficult for me to read. Some of them challenge basic assumptions that I hold dear about Israel, about my narrative. but I felt it was important to honor the Palestinians who showed courage and goodwill in responding to me. And I wanted to show to my Palestinian readers that I'm serious about a different kind of conversation. By giving the Palestinian narratives the last word in a book that I wrote quite honestly to explain my narrative, I felt was countercultural to this moment. Because as we all know, the way that politics is argued, the way that narratives are argued, not only in Israel and Palestine, but certainly in your country as well. You're not supposed to listen to your opponent. You're supposed to defeat and discredit and demonize your opponent. And I'm very proud of the Palestinian letters that appear in the book, and I'm very moved by this process that this book is doing.
Thank you. And again, so Mohammad, as I said earlier, what has motivated you to respond and the way that you have to engage with Yossi and to begin this process, which, as I said, I'm sure has taken a lot of courage and maybe sacrifice in many ways in order to engage in the way that you have. So could you talk a bit about that for us from your perspective?
Well, I think that the book was written in a very courageous way, in a very honest way, in a way that doesn't give discounts to the Palestinian readers. I mean, Yossi comes and brings his real, full truth, the way he sees it, and he doesn't try to beautify or downplay issues of his identity and narrative and sense of belonging to the same land, which I think is my homeland, and he thinks it's his homeland. So it has a strong challenge. It is, in a way, it's like putting the finger in the eye, but not rubbing it. It's like saying, I'm here, I'm present, but at the same time, I'm willing to see you. I'm willing to recognize that you exist. I'm willing to, I'm opening my mind and heart for the challenge. Come challenge me and tell me your story. Tell me what you think. There was an invitation in it, which I'm not used to. Most Israeli Jews I know come and they pour their truth in you, and they don't want to listen afterwards. They just want to tell you their story and to win the debate, and not interested in hearing what comes out of it. He comes in a different way. He comes and says, Yossi comes and says, well, here's my story. Here is my narrative. Here is what I understand from your narrative. And here's where maybe we can talk. And if you talk to me, I will bring your story to my fellow Israeli Jews or the Jews around the world, which makes it worth my time to engage with him in this kind of a dialogue. Because I feel that, one, it's an honest invitation. And second, I feel a vested interest in engaging in this dialogue, because through him, I can get my truth to other areas as well. And so in a way, I feel that I'm benefiting from this dialogue, that my voice gets echoed through this kind of dialogue. So it's not only that Yossi gets to tell his narrative, actually through this dialogue, I get to tell my own narrative. But I think what's more interesting about this is that I started realizing how important this arm stretched by Yossi was it for so many Palestinians, that I promised myself and I promised Yossi I'm going to write my version of letters to my Jewish friends. So maybe I'll come to the University of Illinois and spend maybe a few months and take time, do a fellowship there. And my fellowship, I will write that book, or at least I'll start the first version in the next few months. Because I think that this approach of opening up, and I think that's what's important with Yossi, He didn't open up his mouth only. He opened up his heart, he opened up his mind, and he was willing to say, well, I'm willing, convince me otherwise. Tell me otherwise. Challenge me. There are certain facts that are probably not going to change in my heart and mind, because there are certain facts that have created my identity. You know, we cannot argue about who did Abraham want to sacrifice, because for me, Abraham wanted to sacrifice Ishmael. For him, he wanted to sacrifice Isaac. If he stops believing that it was Isaac, his Jewishness gets shattered, because all of the Jewishness was built on that story that Abraham wanted to sacrifice the father of the Jewish people. The victimhood of the Jewishness starts from that moment. The victimhood of Islam starts from that moment. So if we give up that 3,000-year-old story, it's like we're giving up something so existential in our identity. And so there are things that are not negotiable. The only thing I can tell you, Yossi, is that, believe me, it was Ishmael. And I know it's not going to be convincing. I know it's not going to convince you. But there's no way I'm going to think otherwise. Even if you bring all the books behind you, and you might have proofs that it was Isaac, I will not believe it. For me, it will continue to be Ishmael. At the minute you start realizing that it's not about proving the fact, it's about believing in your version of a fact. That's because for me, if I stop believing it was Ishmael, I'm lost. I need to question a 3,000-year-old narrative for which I build my life story around. I build my existence around. And I'm going to, we're fasting, starting Tuesday next week, we start the month of fasting of Ramadan. The whole book, I mean, Ramadan is the month in which Prophet Mohammad got the Quran in a cave in a mountain. And it was the stories of Abraham. That's what the first version of the Quran, the first segments of the Quran. And 2 months and 10 days later, 70 days later, we will be celebrating a holiday called the Sacrifice Feast, Eid al-Adha. And the Sacrifice Feast, it's a story of Abraham wanting to sacrifice Ishmael. So if I stop believing in that historic narrative, my today's practice of culture and religion and identity and sense of self will get challenged and will get shattered. So I think that what I was able to see in my discussion and dialogue with Yossi is his capacity to think beyond his self, and I think what we create is a mutual additional space that, you know, beyond just me, you know, that you're not talking just to me. When Yossi and I are talking, it's not just the two of us talking. I think it's probably 3 people talking. It's me and Yossi and the additional identity that is common for the two of us, that is combining us together, where we allow us to maybe go to some additional virtual space. I would say it's not that much virtual, but it's more creating a new historic narrative identity, which is not even feasible yet. I mean, it's not touchable. When we speak about creating a new Israeli identity that will be inclusive to the existing Jewish identity and the Arab citizens who are not included yet into it, we're talking about something that is in the making. It's not that much virtual, because there's so many elements of it that are real. If you go to an Israeli hospital, you will find that 35% of the nurses are Arab. You go to an Israeli pharmacy, 55% of the pharmacists are Arab. And so Yossi cannot escape an Arab pharmacist. You know, it's part of his medical consumption today. It's part of who gives him the sense of medical safety. So we did force ourselves into the Israeli Jewish sphere as the Jews forced themselves into our own Arab sphere, whether it is from, I spoke about my daughter earlier, the choice of topic to study. My daughter wanted to study initially medicine, but then she said, well, the Israeli job market will probably appreciate more someone that has a PhD in genetics, because combining it with high tech will put her in the forefront of the job industry or work opportunities in Israel. And she's proving it to be true. Her value is much better than a physician today. And the same thing with my son, who's studying marketing at an Israeli university. He's doing his MBA in marketing because he wants to progress in the company that he works in. And when he was interviewed to the company for a managerial position, they asked him, what are you aspiring for in the company? And he said, I want to be the CEO of a big company that has 8,000 employees in Israel, and the majority of them are Jewish employees. He does not see a glass ceiling for himself. And I think that that's the new space that the dialogue between me and Yossi is escalating to. I'm not sure if the word escalating is the right word, but it rises to that level, which goes beyond the natural space of, my comfort zone is in my village with my family and my relatives and my lookalikes. His comfort zone is probably, again, with his family and his town and his lookalikes. To create a new space, it is personally challenging, but I think it has existential need. And from my point of view, I must say I'm very selfish into this dialogue, because I want to make sure that my kids have a place that they continue to call home, and a country that sees them as their country. Today, Israel sees itself as the state of the Jewish people, not the state of the Israeli people. And if I do not help Yossi and other Jews from the mainstream, not the traditional left-wing Israelis, but Jews that belong to the mainstream, if I do not help them create a new Israeli identity that is big enough, inclusive enough, wide enough to include me and my children, then we will continue to live maybe in our homeland, but not in our country.
Well, thank you both so much. And I know we're running short of time, but there is, your comments really compelled me to try to integrate a couple of the last questions into one, basically because of some profound things that both of you have said. It's very, very clear to me that you both have very different roles. You have different goals, and both personally and professionally, but you share a common vision for a future that's more sustainable than what exists today. So are there issues in your own day-to-day lives that has threatened to derail this critical conversation that the two of you have engaged in? And what have you done to overcome some of those difficult moments in this conversation as you try to move collectively ahead?
Well, I just so much appreciated what you said, Mohammad. And I am coming from this from a selfish perspective as well, because I really care about the honor and dignity of the Jewish people. And we've been a minority for so long, and now this is our chance to be a decent minority. And so I need for your children to be fully equal citizens in the country that we share, our country. That's crucial for me as a Jew. So I'm not doing this for altruistic reasons either. I'm doing this for the Jewish people and for 4,000 years of Jewish history. And maybe, Chancellor Jones, that's a way of segueing into an answer to your question. Because like most Israeli Jews, I live in this conflict, and I experience this conflict very often as a personal threat. So, for example, today's news, an Arab Israeli, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, was released after 35 years in prison. He had killed an Israeli soldier, and he was welcomed back in his hometown as a hero. Hundreds of people showed up in the streets and gave him a hero's welcome. Now, I see that and I react viscerally, like almost every Israeli Jew that I know, which is, it's never going to happen. There's not going to be peace here. How can we talk about a shared Israeli identity when our fellow citizens, a fellow citizen who murders an Israeli soldier is welcomed as a hero? So that was my first initial visceral reaction. And this is part of what it's like on living on a day-to-day. You have these emotional ups and downs. And then you say, okay, calm down. It was his family who received him. Maybe there was, think of the personal dimension. And you try to create a human framework for understanding an incident which I initially experienced as a threat to my existence here. And so you overcome that, and then you think, wait a minute, this is a very important moment in Israeli political history. For the first time, we're really seeing the possibility of Israeli Arab parties being players in the system, and this is a precious moment. So now, Chancellor Jones, I am torn apart every day. I'm torn apart by my existential Jewish fears, by my hopes. Amos Oz, the late Israeli novelist, once put it. He said, "My hopes, my fears are Jewish, and my dreams are Israeli." And maybe that's where Mohammad and I can find some common ground.
Thank you so much. Mohammad.
Well, I would say that maintaining a capacity to continuing to engage in this kind of dialogue, yes, it is first of all, it's a personal challenge, because you don't go to sleep very well at the end of a dialogue, especially if it's intense. And sometimes the intensity of it lasts for a few days, because you need to think either of how to process a certain position or perspective that you heard, or how do you want to even respond to it, if at all. And I think that one of the key components in a successful dialogue is realizing that you don't always have to respond. Sometimes all what you need to do is to be a good listener, and you do not need to prove that a counter perspective, and actually, in a way, to continue to live in the comfort of your narrative, even if it's challenged. Because usually, what you want to do is to challenge anyone that comes and presents an alternative narrative to your own. But with time, I think I learned that I don't need to respond. Okay, I can, Yossi can give me a lecture about his Jewish narrative and how important 1948 independence celebrations were, and without me having to tell him about what it means to me, because for him that was the moment of a historic joy for the Jewish people, and to me that was probably the lowest moment in Palestinian Arab history, with the strongest and deepest pain of the shattering of my people. And I don't feel every time that he needs to tell me his story of celebration, I don't feel I need to tell him my story of pain. Actually, I want to challenge him more today with the fact that our percentage of doctors in Israeli hospitals is bigger than the percentage of Jewish doctors. To show that we're getting out of feeling the poor, miserable victim, and I think that's where I get my power to start debating in a place that I say to him, fine, I get your perspective, I understand it, I respect it, I do not agree with it. Now, within my own circles, there isn't always acceptance for that, because I think that I'm probably maybe a couple of generations ahead of where the rest of my community is. I think that when you ask people, do you think in the Arab community, do you think that this is the right thing to do? They say yes, but first, 1, 2, 3, 4, we condition everything with a lot of preliminary steps, most of them in expectations that the Jewish majority need to prove their goodwill by exercising full equality yesterday, not today. And as a result, we don't trust them. And if we engage in a dialogue, all what we do is actually help Yossi go to sleep with clean conscience at the end of the day. It's like I'm helping him wash his conscience that, well, he's superior, he has the upper hand. And when we engage in dialogue, he allows himself to maybe come down to my level for the 2 hours of dialogue. And then we go back to reality, where hierarchy comes back in play again, where he has the upper hand and he has the benefit of being the part of the ruling majority and the one that creates the structure and the framework of the power structure in the country and benefits out of that power structure. Now go and explain that to an average person in the Arab community, that it's okay to do this 2-hour exercise, even if it's temporary equality, because we do have this chance of being honest and equal and being able to throw the equal narrative and equal ideas. But I think that where I can justify this is one in not waiting for Yossi to grow up as a majority and to create space for equality. Meanwhile, we are working on our own self-incapacity in creating our own capacity and trying to find the proper ladders to climb, and in sending more doctors and sending more high-tech engineers to challenge the Israeli perspective of what an Arab citizen is. So we're not only the garbage collectors, and we're not only the waiters in restaurants, and we're not only the construction workers or the gardeners. We're also their doctors and their computer engineers and their police officers. And the more we build that capacity, the better chance we have in being able to engage in eye-level dialogue and not on a hierarchical dialogue. The problem with the hierarchical dialogue is that it usually has an expiration date. An eye-level dialogue, which is built on some kind of interdependency, has more shelf life. It does last for longer. So for my community, my argument is, well, don't wait for the dialogue. You look at the goal. The goal is fight for your equality. Do not wait for the Jews to create space for you. You build your own capacity. When they see you as a physician, as a doctor who's specialist in this kind of topic or that topic, they'll create space for you. And sure thing, they are creating space because they need us. So it's not an either or. As I said, usually it's too conditional between good relations and equality. The minute I can convince my community that these are two parallel tracks and not conditional tracks, that this is not slowing my progress as a community in the path towards prosperity and equality, then the argument becomes more convincing. And that's why every organization I work for, and it has been mostly organizations that work for good relations, I demand that they pay their dues in a sense of work for equality at the same time. You have no moral right to promote good relations if you do not promote equality at the same time. It's not about good relations. It's not about me and Yossi being able to enjoy music together. It's about changing the power structure.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much for a very dynamic, thought-provoking conversation. But we want to be respectful to those that have signed up to participate in the Q&A session. So I will now turn this back over to Vice Chancellor Garrick for his comments and to initiate the Q&A. Thank you very much. I really have appreciated your candor and your conversation.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Thank you, Chancellor Jones, and thank you to our panelists. Thanks for sharing your rich insights this afternoon. As Chancellor Jones mentioned, we've received several questions from the audience that were submitted during the registration process, and would like to get through as many as possible, so I'll begin now. Given Mohammed's comments, and I think the questions or the comments about the power structure, I think here's a timely question. With the elections going on, what would it take for Arab Israelis to gain a share of political power proportional to their share of the population?
It's a very timely question, Mr. Garrick. I would say two things. One is to do what you as a citizen should do: vote. Increase the turnout rate in the Arab community, which is much lower than that of the Jewish community. In the last elections from the 23rd of March, the turnout in the Jewish community was 67%. In the Arab community was only 47%. That's 20% less. And with that, it means that we send less than half of our potential candidates to the Knesset. If we vote in similar percentage to that of the Jewish citizens, we'll probably get approximately 22 out of the 120 seats in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. But now with the low turnout rate, we only got 10 seats out of the 120 seats. So we reduce our own representation by reduced participation rate. And there are many reasons for the low participation rate. Some of it is blaming the Arab politicians for their very low level for performance, and some of it lack of efficiency of the political participation over the last 73 years, some kind of exhaustion from doing it over and over and over again. I mean, once we did vote at a 78% rate, now we're at 47% rate. So almost half of what we've done, what we've accomplished once. But also seeing that participation does not really change that much of the social economic reality. Poverty rate in the Arab community continues to be very high, almost 4 times the national average. It's 47% of Arab citizens are below poverty rate, while about 11% of Jewish citizens are below poverty rate. So political participation, 73 years of political participation, didn't change it. The second thing we need is not just voting ourselves, but finding the courageous Jewish members of the parliament who would be willing to open up for some kind of political partnership. Now, there was an incident like that, 1992 to 1996, when the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, for the first time, built a government coalition depending on the Arab members of the Knesset, meaning that he did not have a Jewish majority in the parliament. He was dependent on the Arab members of the parliament, and he paid his life for that. He was assassinated because they claimed that he's not legitimate prime minister because he doesn't have a Jewish majority. So you need the Jewish leader that is willing to have the courage to depend on Arab members of the Knesset as full members of the parliament, and not see them as deficient members of the parliament because of their Arab identity. And we haven't had any leader willing to do that until now. There's some kind of talk now that Benjamin Netanyahu, after he exhausted his chance to get a Jewish majority in the Knesset, he might actually change the rules of the game and might get dependent on the Arab members of the Knesset in forming a new coalition after he received today the chance to form a government. But that comes out of opportunism on behalf of Prime Minister Netanyahu and not as a result of ideological change in his belief of equality in the political decision-making structure.
Thank you, Mohammad. Yossi?
The question of Arab participation in the political system.
Seems like he may be having technical difficulty.
Yeah, it looks like it.
And also, I would say the maturation of the Arab minority as
I'm not sure if you can hear us, Yossi, but your video and sound has frozen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I don't know at what point was I cut off.
We missed everything, unfortunately.
So I would say that encouraging greater Arab participation in the political system, and I do think we're at a potential turning point. This is a very important moment, but I think it depends on two things. One is the maturation of the Jewish majority, that the Jews own their responsibilities as a majority and stop acting as a besieged and threatened minority. I think that's the first step, and the onus is on the Jewish majority as the majority. But I believe that the Arab minority also has a responsibility, and that is to reassure the Jewish majority that it accepts the existence of the state of Israel. It accepts the right of Israel to be a Jewish majority country, provided that Israel extends full democratic rights to its Arab minority. But that's a message that I need to hear. I, as an Israeli Jew, need to hear from my fellow citizens who are Arab that they accept the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish majority and democracy. And that's not a message that we hear from most of our Arab politicians. Most Arab politicians actually convey the opposite message, which is that Israel as a Jewish state is not legitimate. And that only reinforces the fear and the hesitancy of the political system to open up to the Arab participation.
Thank you. As a follow-up, Mohammad, you mentioned the historically when how voting turnout has ebbed and flowed over the years. How do you think the state of constant elections in Israel and the political uncertainty, how do you think that impacts the Israeli-Palestinian relationship?
Oh, very much. I think that when a prime minister and or his challenger is in a survival mood, not knowing whether he was going to get elected or not, because he's very dependent on small fragments in the parliament. I mean, today, the smallest political party is 4 seats, and there are parties that are 5 seats or 6 seats. Each one of them holds any prime minister, no matter if he's from the right or from the left, they hold him hostage. If they're not happy, they can bring down his government. This has been the case, actually, since the early 90s. The coalition system, which allows small political parties to be so effective and so influential, is leading us actually in the last 2 years to 4 elections. And I think we're closer today to 5th election than forming a government. Although President Rivlin gave Benjamin Netanyahu the right to form a government today, the chance of this happening is less than the chance of going to another elections in August. This is where we're probably leading. August, September, 5th elections in 5 years. It's a failing system. The coalition system of small parties is actually a failing system. We have 13 different parties out of 120 members of the parliament. 13 different parties, which makes it very sectorial type of politics. Every small sect, whether it is an economic or religious or ideological or national identity based, every group comes and fights for subsects. So the ultra-religious Haredi community from the Sephardic background comes with their own political party. The ones with Ashkenazi background, but they're also ultra-religious, come with another political party. I mean, even the ultra-religious can't come with one joint political party. The Arab political parties, they are now in 2 lists, but the 2 lists have actually 4 different political parties. That some of them were willing to recommend Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, for prime minister, and others were not willing to recommend him. This way, you are lacking what I would call polar energy. Energy of political poles that would determine some kind of a common denominator to the center left versus common denominator to the center right, which will bring us maybe closer to the US political system of a 2 major parties that that one of them is going to form a government, but it's very difficult in the US to bring down a president. In Israel, it's very easy to bring down a prime minister. And as a result, every other issue becomes, other than political survival, becomes marginal, whether it is the Palestinian issue, as in your question, versus the economy, versus how do you fight COVID, versus what do you budget? Do you budget, another sectorial group is the settlers movement. They have a political power that forces a right-wing government to keep paying them so much money on the expense of health services, on the expense of public transportation, on the expense of so many other things that are critical for the rest of Israeli society.
Thank you. Yossi?
As far as a 2-party system, I don't think it's working out all that great for you guys over there. And, Israel is, as Mohammad notes, Israel is really a tribal society. And that's true for the Jewish community, and it's true for the Arab community. And in that sense, I think that as messy as it is, the coalition structure is an accurate reflection of who we are as a society. We are fragmented. We are a society of competing interests within each community, leaving aside the tensions between the communities. And so I think that we probably are stuck with muddling through with this system. But again, I feel that what's truly significant and historic about this moment is that the Arab parties have taken a decision. Most of the Arab parties have taken the decision that they want to be part of the system. They want to be players. And some of the Jewish parties have responded, not enough. And again, as the majority, the onus is on us to really make the first move.
Thank you. Given I'll ask this question, given our large audience, how can students participate in activism for this cause or these causes? I'll open this to all 3 of you, Chancellor Jones, Mohammad, and Yossi.
I like this question, and I'd like to start by giving an answer. Because I keep saying it to the students I work with on daily basis. In my institute, we basically bring Jewish and Arab kids for encounters, and what we always say to them: be part of the solution, don't be part of the problem. It's very easy to be part of the problem. All what you need to do is just come and speak your own truth, speak your own narrative, don't listen to the other, and just keep fighting your own side of the game or the struggle. Depends how you see it. But if you want to be part of the solution, one that's more difficult, it needs more courage. And going back to Chancellor Jones's question, it needs more courage because you need to challenge yourself, your own mental capacity of being able to grow beyond your own comfort zone, beyond your own what you know is real there. Look for solutions, don't look for how to justify existing reality. The truth is probably not invented yet. Most people keep thinking that the truth is behind them. They look back and they bring their history as their truth. I think that truth is what we are going to make in the future. And if we look in futuristic perspective of what do we want society to look like and try to contribute to it. Once I was in a debate with an Israeli professor that I call him the demographic devil. Because he keeps threatening Israeli society by saying, watch out, the Arab citizens are growing so fast demographically, they're going to take us by the numbers, by demography, by natural growth. So once I was with him in a debate, and it happened to be American Jewish visitors from different Jewish federations in the United States. And I brought one specific piece of information. I showed them that an Arab woman with a university degree and a job has less children than a Jewish woman with a university degree and a job. So I told them that instead of having to be racist and being the devil that threatens about being racist, that speaks about the demographic growth as a threat for you, you can actually be generous by offering an Arab student a scholarship. This way you can encourage her to go to university. And if she goes to university and she gets a job, she naturally is going to have less children than a woman that sits at home and is just a housewife that naturally has many more children in our society. And if you challenge them with those kind of challenges, I forced him to go out of his comfort zone of just speaking against the Arab community. I forced him to start looking at a place where a certain problem that scares him can be treated in a positive manner and not to be treated in a negative manner. And if we look at the issues of, the solutions that I keep trying to offer, integration through equality is the safest zone for everyone. That's where you have a win-win relationship. That's where the fact that Arab citizens are contributing more intellect in the Israeli high-tech industry, in the Israeli universities. Only 15 years ago, the Arab students were only 3.5% of the student population in Israel, while being 21% of the population. Today, we are 19% of the student population. This happened in 15 years. And we're 22% of the students of engineering and 30% of the Technion student population, which is our version of MIT. You go through the positive battle and not the negative battle. To keep the blame game doesn't get you anywhere. You need to create a third space, I would call it, a space of the partnership where you see it right, instead of just being able to speak my truth. I know myself and I know Yossi. Yes, he's very smart and he's very acclaimed writer, but I can win a debate with him. I'm sure he thinks the opposite direction. He probably thinks he can win a debate with me. But who cares? Who cares? If I win a debate against him, what difference does it make? I only score points. I don't need to score points anymore. What I need to do is change things on the ground. And to do that, I need a Jewish partner. I can't do it just by capacity building.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with just about everything that you said, Mohammad. Maybe even that you'd win a debate against me. And if there's anyone that I would be happy to lose to, or not too unhappy to lose to, it's you. I fully agree with the direction, with the aspiration, the vision of Israeli society that Mohammad is presenting. In terms of the original question, if I may add just a spiritual dimension to the conversation, and without diminishing for a moment the need for practical solutions to practical problems. But in addition to that, when you ask what can students on an American campus do, the first thing I think is humility, is to step back and to realize the complexity of this conflict. And before leaping in with solutions, listen to people on both sides. Listen to the pain, listen to the fears, listen to the hopes on both sides. Learn. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you want to be a peacemaker, that's a lifetime of inner work. When I listen to Mohammad, I'm hearing somebody who has spent a lifetime working on himself, working on anger, which I recognize as a Jew growing up in the circumstances I did, and working on one's capacity for empathy, to listen. For me, the most important thing that I learned tonight, and I wrote it down, Mohammad, after you said this, which is that I don't always feel I need to reply to everything I disagree with. Sometimes I also need to learn to listen. That requires humility, it requires restraint, but it also requires something else. Embodying the qualities of peace. So that peace isn't just an ideology. It's not just a political platform. It's a way of life. And it determines how I relate to my friend, it determines how I relate to my opponent, and it determines ultimately how I relate to the mega conflicts that we live in. But it's not enough to be for peace. You need to try to be peace. And that is, I can say with a great deal of experience, it's a lifetime struggle and it never ends. And you keep learning new things about yourself that you wish you didn't know. New obstacles in yourself that keep rising and that keep blocking you from embodying peace. But that's the goal. And I'm just very grateful. I feel very blessed to have partners on that journey and to have teachers. For me, Mohammad is a partner on.
Thank you. Chancellor Jones.
Well, Sean, let me say that our colleagues have really said it all. But as the chancellor of this university, I would encourage our students to reflect back on their very, very profound comments about humility and understanding the complexity of this situation. I heard them both talk about empathy and about the ability to listen, to try to understand the other. And I can tell you, it makes me very excited that these are the kinds of things that a university education, a university environment provides our students so that they can become the multipliers of the kind of dialogue and conversation that we've seen here today. Because I don't see a road to peace and reconciling this very complex issue without a dialogue, without conversation, without the ability to understand the other, without the goal of becoming peacemakers, as Yossi said, and the ability to really, as Mohammad emphasized, to work toward some common goals for greater impact for the future. And I'm very, very excited about the dialogue that we've had today, and would encourage our students to think about these comments and these words as they think about their own lived experiences here on campus, and as they think about how do you incorporate that into both their classroom, their advocacy, and just how they exist as members of this vital community.
Thank you, Chancellor Jones, for your final thoughts. I think it's a very good note for us to end on. Again, Yossi, Mohammad, thank you very much for sharing your evening, your experiences, and your wisdom with us. It's greatly appreciated.
Great honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.